Don, I always enjoy talking with you. You're one of the few scientists I know who moves easily in the world of Thomas Aquinas from the 13th century. You don't meet too many people like that, and I suppose that gives me a certain kinship with you, since I spent a lot of my life studying Thomas Aquinas as well. Sometimes I wonder if I really ever did get the point of all of it. But what I like about you is that I think that you have an ability to see things whole. And you have a very synthetic mind. I usually think of scientists as having an analytical mind, break things up into parts and check them out and experiment and so on. And yet I see you functioning in a much more synthetic direction, and I suppose that has an appeal to me. Do you recognize that in yourself, the interest in synthesizing and a holistic approach?
Oh, yes, that's been the focus of my whole life, really, to try to do that.
Yes, and you have written well on that topic, and some of your things that I've read I've been impressed with, and I think it leads us into this whole discussion of religion and science, since they both have to do with context in a way. I think it's very important to distinguish those frameworks within which they work. But I want to use a particular question to get at this, Don, so it isn't too abstract, and that is the debate between creationism and evolutionary theory. And so that's come down to a debate for our schools. Are you going to teach in the schools evolutionary theory only? Or side by side, are you going to have creationist theory, which means, I guess, fundamentally that you accept the truth of Genesis, that the world is made in 6 days, and that God's responsible for all of that. I think it also entails, in my own thinking at least, sort of a limited time frame, thinking of the world as being 4,000 some years old rather than the earth being 4.6 billion years old, which is quite a fantastic difference when you get down to it. So creationism, evolutionary theory, let's begin to wrestle with that a bit.
Yes.
Anything about that strikes you?
Well, what strikes me is that the underlying, I think, flaw in either one of these alternatives is the idea of literal, taking something to be literally true. If a scientist takes his theory of the world or of humans to be literally true and the only kind of truth, then I think he's in error. And likewise, the person who takes the Bible as the source of a literal truth about nature and about humans is also false in that and too narrowly focused, I think.
Well, could we say this, that when you look at this concretely, and I mean, you have a couple of choices. Either human beings sort of came full-blown onto the earth without any precedence or without any relationship to the lower species, or they did not. Could I not say that? I mean, we either evolved from lower life forms, or we appeared suddenly and without relationship to those lower forms. I mean, I don't know that that's got to do with anything mythological or anything. I mean, am I right in saying that, or do you have a different viewpoint of that?
Well, it seems to me that someone that takes the fundamentalist view, the biblical point of view, could say that God created all of the creatures interrelated, that they, instead of saying they evolved to be that way, he created them that way. So I don't see that as a problem, but it's a very static. I think the real problem is that to say that God created it that way is to give the impression of a very static universe.
Well, what the scientific world generally says is that they buy evolution as a theory, right? It's the hypothesis that makes most sense to most scientists today. Can we not say that?
Well, I think there's a problem there, too. I think scientists don't sufficiently realize what they are doing when they say that. On the one hand...
But am I right in saying that is the dominant view?
Oh, yes. It's the dominant view in science, that you can't do biology today without accepting the theory of evolution, that all the various subdisciplines seem to fit together as a result of having this overview of life on Earth.
And not only biology, but other fields as well.
And then it's been extended to physics, of course,
yes,
and talking about the evolution of the universe. But at the same time, the scientist very often says this in a philosophical, religious sense, even though he doesn't acknowledge that. He's saying this is absolutely true. You cannot... He's not saying this is no longer merely a theory. You must accept this as the truth. Mm-hmm. And that's where I think the scientist goes wrong, too.
Well, we had something that we called social Darwinianism at one time. That was following the thought of Darwin, who wrote The Origin of the Species in the 19th century, and propounded, at least in one form, this idea that we have evolved from lower life forms, but that people took it as sort of in a dogmatic way, as a total explanation of all of reality. And so there was a social form of this that I don't know that in all of its details. Maybe you do, but it's that wanted to understand the whole of human existence in those terms. And I think it ended up with having sort of social stratification and so on. It became a method of keeping some races in a lower position. It was used in that fashion. So I believe that that was maybe as an example where an hypothesis that was meant to explain a certain data was extended into the larger realm of social relationships, much to the detriment of minority groups.
Well, yes, and I think the key problem there with social Darwinism is that we did not make a distinction between humans and all other species. That humans, Homo sapiens, was just another species, and hence the theory of evolution explained their emergence and how they fit in with other species as well as it did with any other. And that became a basis of so-called laissez-faire capitalism, and that it's a survival of the, using Darwin again, survival of the fittest. So if someone were born disadvantaged, say even blind or deaf or a cripple of some way, in social Darwinism, or in Darwinism in general, such a person would be allowed to die rather than be taken care of. But see, a larger view of humans is that we can't allow that to happen, that humans are different than other species.
Yeah, so you root the fundamental error there. It is sort of an unfair extrapolation to a larger question, what you've learned from the world of science. In this way, and I think you put that well in relationship to laissez-faire capitalism, where it would simply be the profit motive and there would be very little to do. The cream would rise to the top. The people who really had the right stuff would take over and would gain enormous wealth, and too bad for those on the bottom. They would simply not survive. Survival of the fittest, as you suggested.
Yes.
Yeah, so there we get an example, I guess, of how this, I'm trying to get at this two sides of this, creationism and evolutionary theory, and trying to make sure we understand what we mean by evolutionary theory. Historical precedent comes to mind in terms of this religion-science conflict, and that is to go back to Galileo. Galileo was born in 1564 and died in 1642, just to locate him. He died a few years before the philosopher Descartes did. That was a very shaping thing for the modern world. Descartes died in 1650, often talked about as the father of modern philosophy, and also I think feeds into this problem that we have, a divorce between matter and spirit. But Galileo, in 1632, he published a work which supported what Copernicus had said much before him about a heliocentric view of the universe, where the Earth was not the center and everything revolving around it, but we're revolving around the sun. And of course, something which we obviously hold today and would know from the world of science would make very clear to us. But at the time, the church officials were not thrilled with this, and asked Galileo to recant his views. The Inquisition in Rome, in fact, forced him to do this. And so ever since, the Galileo has been a symbol, not just of a scientific advance, but as a symbol of the fight between religion and science. And the image that Galileo gives is that, yes, here's this free inquiry, finding new truth, the world of science moving forward, and here's the church representing religion, needing to squelch that because they think it really flies in the face of the truth that they hold about the world. It's going to undercut anthropocentrism, undercut the biblical notion of the uniqueness of the human being, etc. Therefore, the Inquisition came into play and forced him to renounce his views. We get a replay often in the modern world over and over of this Galileo scenario, I think.
Yes. Well, I think there are two aspects to the whole Galileo question, both a positive and negative. On the positive side, what Galileo is really saying is, instead of listening to some authority telling you what the world is like, we have a method here that can tell you where you can find out for yourself. You don't have to pay attention to authority. You can find out and come to consensus with other people who explore the world in the same way. And it seems to me that was a step towards what we call democracy and participation with one another, rather than simply being allowed to be told. But on the negative side, Galileo, and I think the church is quite right in criticizing him, Galileo said there's only one language of nature, and that's the language of whatever is measurable. And what essentially the church was saying, and very importantly so, is that no, there's more to the world and there's more to human beings than that which is measurable. And you must not say we can only talk about what is measurable. So he was rightly condemned for that and should continue to be condemned for that.
You know, there's not many scientists, Don, who would say that, who would bring up that dialectical or ambiguity that we find in the Galileo case. I think that's wonderful, but it does speak to, I mean, very much how science functions today and how it thinks it functions. I mean, there are a lot of people in the world of science who just would never say that. I mean, because they end up thinking the empirical method is really the only way of arriving at truth. And it pervades so many fields. I mean, it worked well in physics, so then we said, well, let's extend it to the social sciences. And then we will use our quantifying measurements here in order to find out the truth about human beings. Then it even invaded the field of psychology, which is supposed to study the soul. And the psyche is the Greek, the study of the psyche, the soul, the spirit. And then even in the world of psychology it became, if you wanted to get big grants, money, you had to have experiments, empirical experiments, which would replicate the world of physics, the method of Galileo was propounding and so on, and that modern science works with. And it found its way even as sort of a last bastion you'd expect to rule out this method is the world of philosophy. And in the 20th century with Ludwig Wittgenstein, and his work, it even took over in the philosophical school. So we had what we call the analytical tradition, linguistic analysis, the Vienna school as we called it, that said that even in the world of philosophy you had to get rid of all this other search for truth. And the only thing you could speak of is that which you can speak of very clearly. That even there the empirical method had to dominate. That's how far it got. And I think it worked its way into the mind of the average person. Science can get things done. Religion, forget that. That's with myth and fairy tales and what your parents told you before you were the age of reason. That's religion. And you get rid of that because science is hard-headed, factual, it gets things done, it's effective.
Yes, and then that brings me to even Charles Darwin himself, who in his autobiography talks about that whole experience. He talks about, as a young man, he liked Shakespeare, he liked music, he liked art, he liked to look at the landscape, he enjoyed nature, but that by the end of his life, towards the end of his life, he had lost all of that capability, that capacity for a feeling dimension of understanding himself in the world, and he blamed it on his exclusive pursuing science and said perhaps it's bad to exclusively pursue science because science only stresses the analytical, the rational. And he said if he had it to do over, he would enforce himself to read some poetry and listen to some music every day because otherwise that part of the brain seems to degenerate. So here's a classic example
Yes.
of the man showing the imbalance of science taken too exclusively.
That's amazing. And you know, Don, what we're really doing here is looking at this creationism, evolutionary theory debate in a very different way. The dimensions we're bringing up here you don't find often in the debate, do you? I mean, it's not the way it's usually characterized. What we've really been doing is criticizing from the religious perspective the scientific outlook, which is usually above criticism in this debate in the intellectual world. That is, well, yeah, those people are right on target, they've got it correct, and here's these weird fundamentalists who are pushing this creationism notion. And what you've been bringing out is that there's a proper religious critique of the scientific side of this equation or this debate as well.
That's right,
Yeah.
yes. In fact, if we can even move in a little different direction, see it, what evolution can be understood to mean is it fit very well into the Christian idea of life, death of Jesus Christ. That to say that the world is a process, it's dynamic, that each person participates in, that means that each person can undergo a transformation. So taking that evolutionary perspective, but out of the mechanistic framework and putting it into a religious perspective, why it opens things up much more.
Well, let's look a little bit more at the religion side of this debate. Of course, what the creationists are saying is that you must read the book of Genesis. Well, this gets a little tricky here, but they suggest in one way that you read it literally, but it's not always just totally that way. I got to clarify this a little bit. When you talk, we usually associate this view with fundamentalism. The real point of biblical fundamentalism, which is a 20th century phenomenon, goes back to the turn of the century, is to show that the Bible is inerrant. That's the thrust of it. The Bible has no mistakes. When it teaches history, when it teaches science, when it teaches religion, it's always correct. That is what you must hold on to, because the Bible then is your solid rock. It is the norm by which to judge everything else, and you must show that there is no falsehood in that Bible. So that's how the fundamentalists start out. But then they are interested then in looking at this creation account, as we find at the very beginning of the Bible, in the book of Genesis, which gives us a 6-day creation, a static universe, as you suggested before, and a limited time frame of something like a little over 4,000 years when you add up all the years. Now, they want to insist on that. Now, some biblical fundamentalists will say, well, when it says a day in the Bible, the Hebrew word yom means from sun up to sundown. But when they will say, well, yom means some sort of a geological age. We don't have to say it means just, one 12-hour period or something like that. It could mean an eon, a longer period of time. So what I'm saying is they will go to a non-literal way of reading the Bible, but the big thing is that it's inerrant. And I think that they worry about evolutionary thought. In fact, biblical fundamentalism arose historically in opposition to evolutionary thought. That's why we have it. 2 reasons: because they didn't like the modern ways of interpreting the Bible, and they didn't like Darwin's thought. They were afraid of it. So they must push for this creationism thing that will show that somehow God has made each of the species and holding on to what I consider a rather static worldview.
Well, I think there are 2 points to be made with regard to that. One is if they propose creationism as a alternative scientific theory, then they are simply wrong. It is not a scientific theory, and it should not be taught in a science course because it would mislead students as to what science really is. And if we're trying to teach science, we shouldn't teach them bad science.
Do you want to specify that a little bit more?
Yes, and that essentially what a scientific theory does is to propose a model that will explain the various facts that we have available and to explain it in such a way that we can somehow test it. Well, you can't test the creationist theory. I mean, there may be very good reasons for holding the theory, but they don't fit in within a context of science. So
you can't propose it as a modern form of science.
That's
because
right.
Science works where you can replicate something and show it in an experiment that it's true.
So I totally support my scientific colleagues who say, no, it's anathema to try to teach a creationist theory in the context of a biology course. But in the context of an education, there are different approaches as to how humans came on the earth. Then, in a philosophical religious context, I think you should give fair play to different interpretations, and if the creationists have their different interpretations, you should allow them to express it, but not in the context of science.
Of course, what the Scripture scholar would end up saying is that the dominant scriptural view, again, is that creationism doesn't hold water. It's not a legitimate way of reading the Bible. I mean, if you looked at the major universities in the world and their departments of religion or their divinity schools, you're not going to find an ongoing debate between people who read the Bible from a historical critical method and literalists or fundamentalists. I mean, it is not an accepted intellectual theory, even within the world of theology. That becomes one of the problems there. In other words, most biblical scholars today, and all those that I would say of repute that are at the finer universities, would say that that's not a viable option. It's not like, well, one other theory among others. It simply is outside the pale of where modern scripture scholarship is at. So creationism has trouble fitting in there as well. It's not as simple as saying, well, we'll move it to the theology department and let them teach it there, because I think there are certain Bible colleges, yes, where that will be taught, and you'll have professors who know the Hebrew language and so on who will teach it. But I would say in the major journals, the major theological schools and scripture divinity schools, it's not taught as a viable alternative.
But to this extent, I would support the people who propose creationism. It seems to me what they're really saying is they do not want to send their children to a school where they are taught about the world in such a way that contradicts their own religious orientation. And indeed, our schools don't pay attention to that. I think we need to teach science in such a way that it can be integrated with a particular religious dimension. And the way science is taught today, however, is a literal way, that only the scientific approach is right, and if you have this particular religious orientation, you're simply wrong. Well, that's too much pressure to put on somebody. I think we need to teach it in such a way that this other meaning can be integrated with whatever you learn in science.
Well, I think you could do that, and I think that I respect your sensibilities on that. I think they're fundamentally correct. I would say that one would need to teach, if you're looking at broad theological theories, you would study it much as you would any other religious phenomenon. You can do it from an historical basis, for example. There's no reason why you can't have a course on fundamentalism. Or on scriptural interpretations, which includes that as one of them, because that's a fact. You would study when it originated and how it did so and who the founding figures of the movement are, how it's centered at Princeton University, and talk about Warfield and Hodge and the important figures and the fundament books, the pamphlets called the Fundamentals that people passed out, millionaires, disseminated all over the United States. Well, yes, you could teach all of that, and as one way, and perhaps in that way, you would allow people to probe more deeply part of their religious faith. So I wouldn't have any problem with that. But I'm still saying that within the theological world, it's really not like one competing opinion among others. It seems like it's not outside the pale of the dialogue at the moment. That's how I see it, anyway.
Yes.
Well, we're looking here at how we're trying to get religion and science together, aren't we? And let me, in my own way of saying this, not the only possible way, but borrowing from the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, who talked about different language games, I would say that what we've got here in science and religion are different language games. Science deals with particular systems. It uses the empirical method, logical argumentation, while religion is talking about the source and the goal of all of reality. The Bible teaches religious truths. Religious truths try to say how it is with the divine-human relationship. It looks at the larger picture. Science is dealing with cause and effect, with a particular system and how you put things together within that empirical system. Religion is doing something else. So the simple answer, it seems to me, is that the Bible is teaching religion and not science. So when it gives us a 6-day creation, when it gives us a flat earth with a firmament or tent over it, that's the cosmology of the time. But it's not the intent of the biblical author. It's got nothing to do with our salvation. Religious truth has to do with what we need to live good lives, become better people, come closer to God, reach heaven. That's what the Bible should be all about. And so that's what I mean by saying there's different language games. The language game of the Bible is fundamentally religious truth and not scientific truth. So I think the two things just aren't parallel. I don't see a fight between creationism and evolutionary theory. They're doing something totally different. And I think if you make that distinction, it's possible to, I think, solve this debate, although obviously not everyone's going to agree with that.
Well, I would say it a little bit differently, but perhaps agreeing with you that the creationists and the evolutionary theory both use the rational game, language game. They both talk in terms of categories. The difference between evolution and creationists is that the evolutionary theory says your categories ultimately must be defined in terms of what you can call operational definitions, that you must be able to experiment. Creationist does not. So, but they're still rational theories. It's just that science insists on proposing theories that are testable, where the creationist theory is not.
It's interesting that the creationists and fundamentalists generally have often been very rational in their approach. There are very many logical arguments to show this. The founders of fundamentalism were very rationalistic in that way. They insisted that really their way could be shown by reason to be the more probable way of looking at the world, the true way of looking at it. And that they had no problem with science, they said, but it had to be true science, good science, and evolutionary theory was just poor science. It's interesting. I mean, a lot of people don't understand that about fundamentalists. They were very rational, and they saw science as their ally, as a matter of fact. But this Darwinianism had just gone off the map. It's just poor, false science, and had to be rejected on that grounds.
Yeah, and that's what I see as the problem is, as you say, there's a different a language game that the Bible is playing, and that is it's not a rational language game. It's a analogical, a metaphorical game. It's where your subjective insight, that the Bible can guide you in your own discovery of what the world is about. But that's a different kind of game than a strictly rational kind of game.
And then I think the two games can come together in some ways. I think one of the things that religion ends up doing for science is forcing science to look at what the sort of boundary experiences it deals with. In other words, there are questions that arise from within science if it dialogues with theology. You know, is the scientific enterprise worthwhile? Why are you a scientist? Is there anything to it? Are there moral limits governing what you should do as a scientist? What is the source or basis of these limits? Where did you find those limits? What is the source of all of that? Does the intelligibility of the world suggest an intelligent source to you? These are all kind of questions that would arise within science itself, so that it wouldn't end up just being this empirical method run wild with no larger questions. I would call those limit questions or boundary questions within the discipline itself. The theologian can remind you of that.
Yeah.
And of course many scientists see it from within the discipline as well, right?
Right. And I would go back to the issue of what does it mean to be a human being? Is a human being merely what we can say about that animal from a biological point of view, or is a human being more than that? And of course I would say a human being is more than that, and that's what the theologian and religion tells us about a dimension of humanness that the scientists simply can't talk about, because that dimension is not experimentally verifiable, and yet we can still know about it.
Yes, and I think that again shows how the two can interweave together. Well, we've been talking, Don, about the relationship of religion and science, and we use the example of creationism and evolutionary theory, the debate about whether you should teach it in the public school or not, and it raises a whole lot of questions about how the two things function. We looked at the Galileo case, classic case where religion really stopped science, and as you well pointed out, that's an ambivalent thing, that what the religion should be doing is to say the world cannot be defined solely on rational grounds. But the mistake is to say that somehow the Bible is teaching science, and that that has to be the judge upon what scientists are doing. We need rather two language games to respect the differences, to see the Bible teaches religious truth. That can guide us then in doing the scientific enterprise.